On today's episode of Stupid Things Atheists Say, we're going to look at It's Someone Else's Fault. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Now, this is one I've seen actually from both sides, really. I have seen plenty of Christians say that, so the thing I'm talking about, atheists saying, oh, it's your fault or someone else's fault that I'm atheist. Here's this Christian and they're mean or bad or stupid or whatever, or there's this other Christian and I thought he was good but he turned out not to be, or here's this bad Christian, so that's why I'm not Christian. And you see, you also see a whole bunch of Christians who will do the exact same thing. Take a look. It's imagine if everybody actually was good, but instead they you see bickering and you see various whatever imperfections of various kinds, and so of course it's our fault for not being better. And so something to say in both. Sorry, I forgot. I normally always begin with a disclaimer mentioning in this series, Stupid Things Atheists Say, I'm talking about how there are things which are stupid, which atheists say. Not all atheists are stupid. And if you want to see a very intelligent atheist, check out Zarathustra's Serpent on YouTube. So I don't know why I bother, because there are plenty of idiots on the internet and they won't pay any attention to that. But in any event, okay, I always want to mention that just to be super extra clear for anyone who might benefit if there is such a creature. Anyway, so to be fair to the thing in question, it is certainly the case that when Christians are saintly, this does make it easier for some people to believe in Christianity. Of course, you will also always find the people who want to kill the saints. There are plenty of saints have lots of enemies. It is not by any means the case that people who are extraordinarily loving and kind and patient and generous and have all of the virtues and have them in abundance are universally liked. A lot of people hate them. A lot of people react against this and react against it violently. There's a reason why a lot of saints are martyrs. People who were willing to die rather than repudiate the faith. So you can't push this too far. Plenty of people are, saints, though they attract some, also push away others. And not for being sanctimonious or anything, for being actually good and patient and kind and loving and generous, because there are a lot of bad people in the world who really actually dislike when they see people who are good and react against it. And if you don't believe that, you're just a moron. So, you grow up, be older than 7, and you will have, look throughout the world and you'll discover that actual, goodness is not universally recognized. There are people who react very, very negatively against it. Which also kind of gets to, it kind of brings me to the problem with this. I mean, for one thing, usually when I see this, so when I see this from Christians, about 1 out of 10 times, I think it is actually legitimately a call to be better. And that's good. We all should be better. We should be perfect, just as God is perfect. So, I mean, we should. And that's a thing we need constantly to remind ourselves of, and so those reminders are in themselves good. You can't take that very far, though, into the actual subject matter. You can't take that as an excuse for people who reject the faith for various reasons. About 9 out of 10 times, this seems like it's just people who are trying to sort of passive-aggressively beat up on their fellow Christians in order to win some sort of dispute. So, most of the time, frankly, I don't think it's really anything of value. It's just, as I said, people who are, trying to be less obvious about the fact that they're fighting and, frankly, doing the very thing they're complaining about. There's kind of a funny thing, and I will spend 10 seconds on this digression. But the thing is, you cannot complain about people complaining without being a hypocrite, because you have to intrinsically complain about it. You can't complain about people not building bridges, because that very complaint is not building a bridge to the people you're saying aren't building bridges. You can't complain about, you can't be mean about people not being nice, because like you're not being nice there to those people who aren't nice. So there's a kind of a funny thing that usually comes up with that. And it's probably a good way to tell the difference between those two things. Now, when this comes from the atheist side, I would class this roughly into about 1 out of 10 times you have a person who was seriously confused by, people that they trusted deeply who hurt them. Often parents, for example. So occasionally there's like some real, like there's genuine pain. There's some genuine like grave injury to a person that they're trying to deal with. And the problem is it just doesn't intellectually work. And so I'm going to get there. But like that's at least something understandable and in some sense respectable. As I said, when I see this from atheists, it's about 1 out of 10 times. Probably about, I want to say, another 7 to 8 out of 10 times, it's just an excuse. It's just here's a convenient thing that's hard to answer, so I'll just say this, even though it doesn't logically make any sense and is kind of stupid. But it functions kind of like a gotcha and puts the other person on the defensive if they accept the rhetorical frame anyway. And so that's about, as I said, 7 to 8 out of 10 are that. 1 to 2 out of 10 are just awful people reacting against goodness that puts them to shame. And they're just straight up what they're saying is the bad stuff is actually people who are being better than them and how they really hate that. As I said, that's about 1 to 2 out of 10 times that I see this really look like they fall into that category. Now, the problem with all of it is it doesn't logically follow in the slightest. You can see this very simply in why people talk about the ad hominem fallacy. The fallacy of arguing that somebody's argument is true, not because of any merits of the argument, but simply because of the person, simply because the person is a bad person, ostensibly speaking. And the reason why that doesn't work is because it doesn't matter. No amount of a human being a liar or selfish or lecherous or whatever means that God doesn't exist. There's absolutely no way one human being's sins can possibly prove that. You can try to work an argument from evil, although it's particularly stupid if you try it from a single person. The argument from evil, though it does not work, and I've addressed this in other places for the simple reason that there is absolutely no way to argue from finite information that you can't, that the permission of the evil that we see is not part of greater good, that could not be brought about without it. You would need to be omniscient to be able to do that, so you can't make the argument from evil work. But to the degree that you at least can rhetorically push it, it works a lot better if you talk about natural disasters, plagues, earthquakes, tsunamis, things like that work way, way better than there was one guy who lied to me. So it still doesn't really work, even for trying to push in the direction of the argument from evil. But it just logically makes absolutely no sense. I don't believe that Christianity is true because I have met a bad Christian, or I've met several bad Christians, or, the 5 Christians that I knew were all bad. I mean, they're related to each other and, it's a tiny sample size, and I haven't bothered to learn anything about anyone else amongst the, hundreds of millions. I'm going to assume they're all just as bad as the 4 people that I ran into. Whichever version of that. I've seen all of these things from different people. And again, people are almost never this explicit. They usually take longer to get to the point. They usually obfuscate, put things more rhetorically. But if you get to the actual logical meat of what they're saying, that's the part I'm presenting. It's not helpful to anybody to use deceptive rhetoric. So I'm not going to repeat their deceptive rhetoric. All the rhetorical atheists in the comments who are rhetorical thinkers who only recognize rhetoric and not actual logical content will of course say, oh, you're straw manning it because you didn't phrase it in exactly the rhetoric that I did. You only said the logical equivalent to it. Well, it's the problem with rhetorical thinkers. They're not really thinking. Anyway, so, like, this whole thing, it does, like, it does appeal to sympathy, right? Like somebody who is betrayed by somebody they should not have been betrayed by, and since they shouldn't have been betrayed by anybody, that's anyone they were betrayed by, but especially if it was, somebody who was in a position of authority over them, like, parents, teachers, priests, etc. Like, if there's somebody who is, like, genuinely bad there, it really, your heart really does go out to them. Like, that's terrible. That's awful. It's a terrible thing to suffer through. And life is hard. Life is hard for somebody who has suffered as a result of that. And that's true. But, like, that's as far as it goes. Like, yeah, it really sucks when bad things happen. It's really unfortunate. It is very much to be pitied. It is a thing very much where one should try to give extra help to a person who has been hurt. But it has no logical implications whatsoever. Like, my father believed, not my personal father is a very kind man, but, my father, would talk about Jesus, and also he, was mean and cruel. Yeah, that's terrible, but, like, it has no logical implications. And at some point, you need to grow up and be an adult human being and ask yourself the question, what is actually true about the world? And I met a terrible person. Well, it doesn't mean that everything they said was wrong. I mean, like, did this terrible person believe the earth was round? Does that mean you should be a flat earther? Well, no, obviously not. And so, there are other emotional reasons that go along with this. But not with flat earthing, but logically speaking, it's the same thing. Like, like if Hitler believed the earth was round, does that mean that all decent people should reject that and believe in the flat earth? No, because just because Hitler was a very evil man does not mean that you should reject everything that he believed to be true. You should only reject the false things he believed to be true, but you should also reject the false things of that incredibly good people believe to be true. You should just reject false things, and you should embrace true things. And the people who believe in them, like, there are a posteriori arguments, right? So I'm not saying that there is, if you look at, essentially you can tell a tree by its fruits, right? Like, if you look at if you look at what in general do the people who adopt this belief tend to do after adopting this belief? Do they become better or worse? Where do they go? Now, you do want to ask the question that way, incidentally, because especially adults don't change that much when they change beliefs. This is a thing a lot of people get very, very wrong, incidentally. I don't know why. Human beings have two stages, childhood and adulthood. And in childhood, they're very plastic, moldable, very changeable. Childhood only lasts for a while. By the teenage years, that plasticity has gone way down. Like, you still get a fair amount of it in, like, the early teenage years. By, like, 18, 19, people tend to be a lot less plastic. They will have, in their childhood, they will have adopted their norms of behavior. They will have adopted their various sort of customs and attitudes, their reactions to things, the reactions of pleasure and disgust, their reactions of what they're attracted to and what they're not attracted to. I don't mean sexually. They're like how things like how polite do you tend to be to people. What does politeness consist of? Things like that. All sorts of actions. Like, what are the things that you do? Like, is it fine to cheat on a spouse, or is it really, really horrific to cheat on a spouse? All sorts of things tend to get set in childhood, and then they don't change that much in adulthood. And a lot of people make the mistake of seeing, adult converts don't really behave all that differently. Like, sometimes they do, and, we're going to ignore whatever struggles they actually have in trying to change their habits because they're adults now, and therefore a lot less plastic. But, like, you see a ton of that in assuming that, like, if you raise somebody, for example, if you raise somebody as atheist, they'll come out exactly like somebody who was raised Christian but became atheist as an adult, and no, they won't. But, it's because, like, children aren't adults. Anyway, the same thing really applies when you're looking at, like, what sort of fruits does a tree produce, you need to look at when a person, like what was a person, especially for any sort of adult convert, what were they before and what did they become afterwards, and look at that relative difference, because you're looking at people who are not very plastic. You also need to look at what are people who are actually raised as the thing and how do they behave. And there you're not looking at the difference because they're being raised in this way. So you need to look at that and see how that's going. At the same time, too, you also need to... what's also difficult about telling a tree from its fruits is you need to actually tell the difference between people who merely claim to be something and people who actually are that thing. So, for example, people who claim to be Christian, but in all of their actions act as if Jesus didn't come to save the world and God doesn't exist, you need to be a little bit iffy in terms of how, what sort of tree is this whose fruit you are looking at? Are you looking at the fruit of atheism, or are you looking at the fruit of Christianity? And as I said, and this is the thing you have to actually look at on a case-by-case basis, when you're evaluating these things. And the same is true of, Islam, Buddhism, atheism, etc. For each person, you need to look at, how much are they, how much are they consistent with their beliefs in the way they act? How are they actually raised? Because, in the real world, you have plenty of people who are raised superficially in whatever the dominant culture finds, superficially in some culture, possibly and frequently the one dominant, often locally dominant culture finds to be acceptable. And then they're often raised in other ways, sort of under the surface. And so you need to actually really truly look at this. You need to look and see what actually goes into their considerations of how do they do it if you're trying to figure out what are the fruits of these belief systems. And it works both ways, incidentally. You have plenty of atheists who really aren't atheists, the sort of people who will talk about the universe in personified terms, the universe owes me this, or the universe will watch out for you, or the universe will see that justice is done. You're not actually atheist. You're some sort of philosophical theist, or kind of vaguely paganish sort of monotheist, kind of vaguely paganish sort of thing with just weird terminology. So, this cuts in all directions. You can't attribute them, somebody who is going to talk like that, you can't attribute to atheism proper. So this cuts absolutely every way. Evaluating, telling a tree by its fruits is a difficult thing to do, because you have to really look. Now, in the original of telling a tree by its fruits, incidentally, Jesus was actually talking about individuals. This is way, 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 way easier to do in the case of individuals. If an individual is consistently kind and generous and honest and loyal and so on, you kind of can figure out what sort of person they are. And if they're not, well, also you can tell what kind of person they are. Human beings are much easier to figure out by telling looking at their fruits. Do they merely talk about goodness, or are they actually good? You can tell a lot about a person this way. And in the original context in which Christ said, talked about telling a tree by its fruits, it actually works. It's not that it doesn't work, it's just it's way, way, way harder in terms of what are the consequences of various beliefs. So, while there is some validity to that, its enormous difficulty means that you can't really use this as very much of a primary sort of way of telling things. What sort of culture are people raised in? And, so for example, if people are raised in a culture with tremendous amounts of fornication going on, where they are taught that fornication is good, like modern America, for example, commonly you see the idea that fornication is actually is straight up good, is healthy and beneficial, that fornication is a virtuous action, is a thing you see a lot of modern Americans actually saying, especially in media. Less so in my experience in ordinary life. It's not the sort of thing people will converse about in the grocery store all that often. Even there, you'll see that a fair amount. So in a culture in which people are massively in favor of fornication and everywhere teach that fornication is good, fornication is virtuous, fornication is the way to be a good human being. And then you look at people who adopt the belief that fornication is wrong. Well, it's not very sensible. It doesn't make much of any sense to say like, well, these people who are raised in this environment where the entire culture is shouting about how morally virtuous fornication is, don't completely not, they don't just, stop. None of them fornicate. It's not the case that none of them fornicate. Some of them, in fact, do. So, obviously, this is all just bullshit. Well, that's dumb. It's just really dumb. If you know nothing about human beings, fine. But, learn something about human beings. That's not a meaningful way of looking at how human beings behave. That's not a meaningful way of looking at how human beings interact with things like temptation. That's not a meaningful way of looking at how human beings try to be good. And this is where, too, a lot of the... I need to do an entire episode on this whole, human beings are good, are basically good idiocy that you see from a lot of atheists. But this is where a lot of that comes up, this assumption that people are basically just good. And yeah, if you're starting from there, you're not going to understand anything about human beings whatsoever. In short, on that point of it, yeah, it really doesn't get you very far. You can try to do some amount of looking and seeing what people are like who believe various things. But there are a lot of confounding variables in that if you're going to try to make this even vaguely reasonable. You're going to need to really become very familiar with all of the confounding variables that play into it. It doesn't really work. There's something that's not completely invalid to it, but I don't see anybody ever trying this in the way of doing the massive amount of work that's involved in actually trying to come close to making this legitimate. So, if somebody does, then okay, fine, but they're not going to say it this way. They're going to reference the massive amount of work that they've actually done. So while there is that caveat, it doesn't really work. And for the rest of it, really, frankly, most of it's just a freaking excuse. It's just saying yeah, I could work harder, but there's that person who isn't working harder, so I'm not going to. If he's not going to be good, I won't be good. And you see this from really young children. Really, really young children will do this. If he doesn't clean up the toys he threw on the ground, I'm not going to clean up the toys I threw up on the ground. I threw on the ground. That's it's how this makes sense to children. By the time they can explain, they don't say it anymore. So it's really hard to figure out what is going on inside of their heads. To a great degree, it largely seems to be they don't want to do the thing, and they're looking around for any bit of leverage they think that they have. Okay, the way deals work is I say that if this happens, if you don't do this, then I don't do that. And then they pick things, but they don't have any actual logical structure to them. They just pick something and say well, if that doesn't happen, then I'm not going to do my part either, as if they're engaging in a negotiation, not at the tail end of having done things, now just dealing with their responsibilities. Just the same, this whole well, he's not good, so I'm not going to be good, is basically just that. It's acting as if a person's negotiating something, and there's nothing to negotiate. We exist. We have the duty to find out what's true. We're at the tail end of a thing that entails responsibilities, and it's just up to us to actually fulfill our responsibilities, to find out what the hell is true, and to be good according to what goodness actually is. And so, there really isn't actually very much to this. It's cited often with lots of anger, lots of sound and fury, but, like Macbeth said, it signifies nothing. And so, yeah, it's, as I said, 7 to 8 times out of 10, it's just a sort of childish tantrum. It's a sort of pathetic excuse. Like, if you were better, then I, might believe. No, you wouldn't. That's not what's going on. You're just straight up lying. And so, yeah, like that's pretty much the majority of it. It's just that. It straight up is just people who are lying because it rhetorically sounds good, and they don't really mean it any more than the 4-year-old who doesn't want to clean up the toys that he scattered all over the floor actually means that, if his brother cleans up his toys, then, the 4-year-old will clean up his. Because they don't, by the way, if you've never been a parent, if you actually try this just as an experiment, I'm saying okay, I'll get your brother to clean up his toys, then you'll clean up yours. You get the brother to clean up his toys, because after all, he should anyway, right? There's no harm in making the brother do what the brother should do. And then they never, it will never happen that the child will go, okay, well, he cleaned up his toys, so I will fulfill my end of the bargain and do the thing I really don't want to do and clean up my toys now. Never happens. And, the same thing will happen with, as I said, 7 to 8, well, actually 8 to 9, out of the times I've seen this from the atheists. If you actually were to have them encounter this extremely holy Christian that they claim that they've never encountered, but if they did, this would make the difference. It doesn't make a difference. It won't make a difference. So, there's that one time out of 10, in what I've seen, in which you've got a person who really is dealing with some serious betrayal and has issues to work through. The thing is, they're almost never the people you're going to see on the internet who are doing this. These are people where this is going to come up in some sort of heart-to-heart conversation. This is not going to come up as people shouting talking points at each other on comment boards and stuff. So people don't pull out things that have hurt them very deeply to strangers as part of random conversations. That's not how human beings function. So, this does actually exist, and these people need a lot of help. And the thing is, well, I mean, you just, since these are people who need help and maybe can receive it, and so if it's a person who can receive help from you, then they're very much, you should help them. But that kind of just generically, if there's a person who needs help and can receive it from you, it's probably been given to you to help them, so, help them. And, that helping is going to involve a lot of patience and kindness and generosity and, talking to them and helping them to, sort of explore the pain that they felt and the difference between what they were lacking as a child and what, a real healthy human relationship is, and people who won't run away from the fact that being with them hurts, and people who aren't looking to get something from them, who are just looking to give to them, that comes up from time to time. I suspect, given how much time is involved in being that person for another person, I suspect it comes up very rare for each of us. It will come up pretty rarely in our life that we are given to be that person for another person, just because there isn't that much time in the human life. Because, this may well take years, years of patiently being with somebody and being good to them for years, through good times and bad. And the only way that, they can really see that, you actually are being loving is through all of the things, all the situations you can't manufacture, in which you're not going to react like somebody who's just out for themselves, or like somebody who's needy. That in the same way that a courageous person can't prove that they're courageous until there is some sort of danger that they actually do have a moral obligation to face. That's why you can't prove to anybody that you're courageous just by going whitewater rafting or jumping out of an airplane or whatever, because there's no actual reason for you to go do these things. You're just doing them for some reason other than a moral imperative to do them. And so, you're getting something out of this. whichever of these things is, and it's perfectly legitimate, by the way, to enjoy like extreme sports. This is not me knocking on extreme sports. I'm just saying a person doesn't prove that he's actually courageous by jumping out of an airplane for fun because he's getting the fun out of it, or he's proving something to himself, or whatever. A person proves that he's courageous when he gets nothing out of doing the dangerous action. It's just an obligation on his part to do it, and he goes and does it. That's when a person proves that he's courageous, because that's what courage really is. Courage is doing something dangerous, even though you get nothing out of it, just because this is the right thing to do. Like, can you rely on a person to do the right thing when it costs them? Well, the only way to tell that is when it costs them, and they can't manufacture that circumstance, because if they manufacture it, they're getting something out of it. This is, incidentally, one of the difficult things about finding a mate, is that a lot of the stuff that you need to know about them, you only find out in circumstances that are really hard to find out about, or, really hard for that to come up. Like, how does a person deal with a stressful situation? How does a person deal with having lost something together, like losing money? Like, how does a person deal with, like, you making a honest, good faith mistake that costs them? Are they generous and forgiving and kind, or are they petty and mean and selfish? Well, the only way to find this out is when you make a mistake that's a good faith mistake where you were trying to do the right thing and failed. And it, hurts them. It's gonna come up eventually. Like, if you're married to a person, it will come up eventually, but like, it's really, really hard to you intrinsically can't manufacture that circumstance, because if you're manufacturing it, it's not a good faith mistake. And so the reaction is not the one in question. Similar kind of thing. And for that reason, a person that you're going to be helping like this, somebody who's, had a traumatic childhood or what have you, had somebody close to them, somebody responsible in their life who betrayed them significantly, the only way for them to figure out that your love for them is real is when it stands the test of time. That is, when it stands the test of all the various things that happen very irregularly, very unusually. And you stick around and you do the right thing when these rare circumstances come up. And so that's why I do suspect, as much as, one would want to be the person to help such a person, it frequently probably is not in fact given to us, just because you can't do it for that many people, not legitimately. Not in truth. Like, it doesn't work that way. So, but if you do find such a person, then, do your best. And, you may well not be the person who is going to be that for them, but maybe some amount of human kindness, some amount of generosity and love and patience and being willing to suffer with another person and so on. Maybe you'll plant a seed, or maybe you'll till the ground so somebody else can plant a seed. Or maybe you're just removing a few rocks so that somebody else can till the ground so that somebody else can plant the seed. Goodness is never wasted in this world, because God will see that goodness is used for his good purposes. And so, whatever it is that you've been given to do, don't hanker after more. Just do what's been given to you to do. But in that circumstance, if you think that's the sort of person that you're, who's saying such a thing, it's probably not very useful to point out to them that it logically doesn't follow. Like, maybe, some amount, some very minor amount of pointing out that it logically doesn't follow. But, since they're not really trying to make a logical argument, they're trying to tell you that they've been badly hurt, and that they're looking for some sort of human connection. In that rare circumstance, if that's what you really think you're dealing with, maybe err on the side of caution and presume maybe it's that. But again, mostly in private conversation, not in people, playing games and comment boards on the internet. That's a time when very much, a person's not trying to make an argument, and they're not looking to receive arguments back. They're looking for some sort of actual human interaction. And what's also unfortunate about that, just as a side note, and this is why also relatedly I bring up the whole, removing the rocks so that somebody can plow the field, so that somebody can plant the seed, is that a lot of people who have been traumatized in that way often have this weird mix of like avoidance and longing. So they want a human connection, but the moment they get anything that looks like it, it terrifies them, and the avoidance comes forward, and they push people away. And like there's some amount of the fact that, you know, they push you away and you don't go, but you also don't chase after them, that then, you know, they come back and they're a bit less scared. But it's quite possible that like that'll happen a few times and then they'll just run. And maybe that's the removing a rock, is that they had some experience where like the other person didn't actually do anything, they just ran, and they feel stupid about having run. But maybe that will set them up to do better with the next person who's it's been given to do more. So with a person like that, patience, patience and gentleness are often a good idea, especially the patience part. Such people are often very rough, and it varies. We're very rough people, whether or not you should be rough back. There are a lot of people who are rough who like only respect other people who are rough. There are other people who are rough but don't fully realize it, and so you kind of need to be gentle with them back. So it varies. As I said, consider very much the context. If you've got somebody who's doing their best to try to be, Christopher Hitchens in one of his debates, you're not finding a sincere person here, who's actually, you're not finding a person who's like sincerely trying to make a human connection because they've been hurt and they long for, love, not erotic love, but, agape, the generous love, love, willing the good of the other as distinct from, for the other's sake. Odds are in that sort of context, you haven't run into that. You never know in this world, but odds are pretty good in that sort of context. So, bear the context in mind as well. And, most of the time it's just a lame-ass excuse. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. If you like this video, then clicking the like button, according to YouTube, will make them more likely to recommend it to others. If you know anyone who might get something out of this video, then it would be kind to share it with them, or just share it on social media in general. And if you'd like to see future videos of mine, you can subscribe. And if you're not in the habit of checking your subscriptions page regularly, then I suggest clicking the notification bell and setting that to always, because otherwise subscribing to a channel basically just sort of like gives YouTube a hint that maybe it should consider recommending these videos to you, possibly at some point, if they think so. It's a funny world we live in. God bless.